Good morning, and thank you all for being here. It's truly my pleasure to introduce to you Loren Taylor. I've been advising graduate students for 17 years now, and sometimes projects come along that are unique, exciting, and require a student who has just the right skill set. I feel so fortunate that Loren found my lab at just the right time. If you took a moment to look at Loren's CV, you would see that it demonstrates her passion for bridging science, management, and policy. She's had a really diverse career thus far, shaped by her experience across NGOs, government, and consulting. If you look a little bit deeper into her CV, you'll see she graduated from Eastern Kentucky University with a BS in wildlife management. From there, she got a position with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife as an avian biologist, and she had that position for a number of years before moving westward. She served as the executive director for Wyoming Untrapped, a really interesting organization that promotes trapping reform through education and advocacy. A few years ago, she formed her own consulting firm, Core Roots Consulting, and she has had a major contract with the Beaver Institute. More recently, as of about a week ago or 10 days ago, she became the Beaver Institute's Science and Policy Director, a position she's thrilled to have. You'll also notice that Loren has lots of life experience. When she moved westward at the height of the start of the pandemic, she actually had positions as both a pastry chef and a balloon wrangler in Jackson. And when I saw this on her CV, I thought, okay, this is a person that when faced with challenges can pivot and adapt. That's somebody who's going to excel in graduate school. Loren also has amazing people skills and that irresistible Kentucky drawl. I knew she would be a great fit for this project and for my lab. So now on to her project. I think we can all agree that restoring wetlands is critical, but how to do that effectively is the challenge. As scientists, we can develop best practices for seeding and planting based on sound science. But if we don't actually acknowledge the realities that managers face, our results will never be applied. Our research team has spent much of the past decade looking at the ecology of native plants to best inform their restoration. But we and many others have ignored reality, what actually drives manager decisions, costs, logistics, and other human factors. So Loren's project was a really unique opportunity to address this gap in the literature and practice. And Loren's project required diverse skill sets in ecology, social science, and management. And you'll see how it all comes together in her presentation. I'll turn it over to Loren now.
Thank you so much, Corin, for that lovely introduction. And thanks to everyone who is in the audience today and interested in learning about my research. Without further ado, let's jump right on into my presentation, which is titled Integrating Manager Perspectives into the Evaluation of Wetland Revegetation Strategies. Okay, let me just double check my clicker is working. All right, so I have a presentation outline here that I want to set us up for how I'm going to be moving through this talk today. So first, we're going to start off with some research motivations. Then we'll jump into my first chapter that will be covering revegetation decision-making and knowledge exchange. Then we'll jump into the second chapter, which will cover revegetation technique evaluations and technique trade-offs. And then I'm going to send you home with some takeaway messages. So ecological restoration is the practice of assisting the recovery of a degraded ecosystem. This requires multiple different stages, including assessment, planning, implementation, and monitoring, with each of these stages requiring multifaceted decisions that are all influenced by social, logistical, institutional, and ecological factors. So all of that to really say that the ecological restoration is really complicated, and so are those decisions. So this complexity in these restoration decisions can greatly benefit from collaborations between researchers, land managers, policymakers, and other stakeholders. And by doing so, we can diversify the types of knowledge that are really baked into that restoration process. And I want to pay special attention to local and management knowledge in these contexts, because by incorporating these types of knowledge, we gain a deeper understanding of that local ecosystem as well as understanding some of those institutional constraints that might be present for managers. We can also identify factors that enable and constrain restoration, and ultimately understand the role that ecological science actually plays in this decision-making process. So these collaborations and management knowledge become even more important when we're evaluating restorative methodologies such as revegetation in these complex, less understood systems like wetlands. So wetland revegetation in particular has lagged behind other ecosystem types. And wetlands, due to their natural characteristics and their location on the landscape, are highly prone to invasive species occupation, which often requires restoration action. So researchers have indicated that in these settings where this invasive species management has occurred, that revegetation is often necessary when native plants are slow to or never recover post-management, and when those recovering species are considered low in diversity or poor quality habitat, and also when those invasive species have a really high reinvasion risk. Researchers have also indicated that managers in the Intermountain West have an interest in revegetating wetlands, but they lack the resources and guidance on how best to proceed. So knowing that there is a need to revegetate and recognizing that there is an interest in how to do so really leads to the question for us as restoration ecologists: how can we best provide guidance to these managers who are interested in initiating or improving their own revegetation practices? Excuse me. So in order to really address that question, we first need to bring out our inner land managers and recognize that for these managers, the selection of revegetation strategies really requires the consideration of practical and ecological factors, as well as recognizing these contextual variabilities and how they play into those strategies. And this is per project. So we also need to understand that by identifying what resources are actually relied upon and preferred by managers will ultimately aid in that knowledge exchange and uptake of these recommendations, leading to more action. So this sets us up for my first chapter, where we will be covering revegetation decision-making and knowledge exchange. So for this chapter, I had two primary research questions. The first one being, what factors enable and constrain wetland managers' revegetation decision-making? And two, what information or resources could assist wetland managers in revegetation decision-making? So this study focused on the Great Salt Lake watershed, which is highlighted in purple on this map. And this is located in the northern part of Utah and southern Idaho. And I just want to recognize that for managers in this area, they're commonly encountering invasive species. And this invasive species management is often the impetus or reason for revegetation. So for my methodology here, I really wanted to gain a very deep understanding of all of these different factors that are really impacting these decisions. And I also wanted to speak directly with managers to understand what resources could really truly guide them and that they would actually use in this decision-making process. So because of wanting this depth of understanding, this led me to semi-structured interviews with wetland managers. So for my sampling frame here, I started with a wetland ecology and restoration lab contact list of potential managers within that watershed. This was a list of 40 individuals. But because I really wanted to capture that local and management knowledge that I mentioned was so important previously, I did incorporate a participant inclusion criteria. So this looked like including two criterion that each of these participants had to meet, which was revegetation experience, meaning that they had implemented at least one wetland revegetation project in the last 5 years, and two, decision-making responsibility. So they perceived themselves as responsible for or influential in making these revegetation decisions for wetlands in particular. Now, I conducted my recruitment for these participants over email and through referral. And I also offered each participant the option of conducting interviews via Zoom, over the phone, or in person. Ultimately, I ended up with 13 interviews total. And also, I did recognize that governance structure and the mechanism can really play an important role in how these decisions are made. And because of this, I wanted to make sure that I did have a wide variety of different employer types that were included in my sample. So ultimately, what this looked like is I had 15% of my participants that were federal government, 15% that were private, 15% local government, 23% NGO, and 30% state government. All of my interviews were recorded and transcribed, and then I conducted thematic analysis and intercoder agreement in Atlas TI. And for anyone who's not familiar with the social sciences and what thematic analysis is, it's simply a method for identifying, analyzing, and reporting themes within a data set. So myself and another independent coder coded these transcripts until we collectively reached 80% agreement on 100% of those codes for 23% of my transcripts. And then I calculated theme prevalence across the data set. So these are my results for my theme prevalence by research question. So we can see here that my first research question had 12 key themes that showed up and 2 sub-themes. And then my second research question had a total of 5 themes. Now I want to draw your attention to these first 7 themes in this first research question. We can see here that all of these 7 themes had equal prevalence, meaning they were all really important for every participant of my study. And so that is capacities, cost, goals and objectives, monitoring and evaluation, site conditions, managing adaptively, and governance and partnership support. Similarly, I want to draw your attention to these 2 key themes that showed up in my second research question, again, having equal prevalence across the board for all managers, and that's experience in peer-to-peer learning. Now, I want to touch on experience really briefly because in the context of my study, this was really personal experience gained by these managers through doing revegetation. So they're learning by doing it, trial and error, if you will. But this really isn't something that we can provide as a resource to managers. It's rather something they acquire as they go. So for this reason, we're going to focus only on peer-to-peer learning opportunities as an actual resource that we can provide to these managers. And then finally, I just want to mention that in an ideal setting, these 2 findings, the findings for question 1 and question 2, will be linked. And what I mean by that is if we get in a habit of actually incorporating these 7 key findings that we see identified in question 1 into the resources that we then provide to managers in question 2, ultimately we will be providing a more meaningful guidance resource to these managers that can more effectively help them make those decisions. And I'll show you how we integrated that later in my talk. Okay, so I did break out my results here into those 2 different questions. So just as a reminder, my first question was what factors enable and constrain wetland managers' revegetation decision-making? Now, I did mention that we had 7 key themes for this question, but for the sake of time today, we're only going to be covering 4 of those. And that's goals and objectives, cost, capacity, and site conditions. So the way I'm going to be presenting you these results is I'll be showing you some quotes from managers that kind of highlight how these different themes interact in that decision-making process. And I do just want to recognize that you will see color coding in these quotes, but it's not showing that that's a single participant. It's just to break up these different quotes. So these are all different people. So this first participant here says the technique and the way that we seed and what seed we use varies a little bit, but the end goal is the same. So the big takeaway here is that we typically have an overarching restoration goal for these managers, and then they are taking a look at these different revegetation techniques and deciding which one of those techniques might help them meet that goal more effectively. We can see that again in this second quote here, where we have a participant that is describing erosion problems that they are experiencing on their impounded wetland areas. So there's a lot of impounded wetlands in this region. They have dikes that get damaged through wave action. And so this participant says, where we have more erosion problems, I'm doubling and tripling up on the mats where the previous plugs weren't successful. And in this context, they're referring to wetland sod mats. And so they are actually adapting their revegetation strategy as a result of how well these techniques are meeting their goals and objectives. Okay, so next we have the theme of cost. So everyone who has worked in the restoration space is really aware of how expensive restoration is. But regardless of what governance structure we might have at play, we will all have something similar or something in common, and that is a restoration budget that will have to be adhered to. And the percentage of that budget that gets allocated towards revegetation in particular is really variable between these different managers. And we can see that kind of displayed here in these quotes. So this first participant is talking about revegetation in general. And they say, if I have money in the budget, I can do it. And then the next participant says, we use seed almost exclusively because of cost for installation more than plugs or other plant types. And so what I just want to mention here is these different revegetation techniques are variable in how expensive they are to implement. And so this is being taken into consideration by these managers when they're selecting a revegetation technique. Next, we have a participant that says, if I had ample budget, I would put sod mats everywhere. So what I want to highlight about this is that sod mats tend to be a higher performing technique in these ecological outcomes. However, regardless of how well they're performing in that category, if they are so cost prohibitive, meaning if they are so expensive, then they're not necessarily something that can practically be applied by these managers. So this really shows how important costs are in this selection process and in these decisions. And then finally, we have a participant that's trying to provide advice to other managers that are wanting to initiate a revegetation plan, and they recommend use all revegetation techniques available, and it just depends on your budget. Okay, next we have the theme of capacity. And for the context of my research, capacity is really the labor and time required to implement revegetation. So this first participant, I might summarize this quote a little bit. They say personnel and time necessary to manage and implement restoration is probably another major constraint. We're often getting a lot of pressure to spread out, and I'm trying to provide a counterpoint that we need to narrow our view and make a fewer number of projects more successful. So the big takeaway here is that capacity can really be the driving factor that's setting the size and scale of these projects. And managers have to consider what capacity they have, because ultimately, at the end of the day, we have to have some type of labor force to put these restoration practices on the ground. And so this is something that really has to be thought about early on in the planning process. And then next, we have a manager that says manpower is going to change year to year. So the reason why I put this quote here is because oftentimes these managers don't have a substantial enough staff or permanent staff in place to actually implement these revegetation. So that means they're often turning to external labor sources in order to implement them, which might be volunteers, it might be seasonal staff, even be contracted staff. But regardless of that, it can fluctuate from year to year and from project to project. So ultimately, capacity really has to be considered with how they're selecting these different techniques. And for the last theme that we're going to be talking about for this first question, that is site conditions. And I honestly think that the manager that said this first quote put it perfectly. And they say, our constraints are fairly static. Our sites are highly diverse. And so I would say that the site selection drives the decision on what type of vegetation you're going to transplant or revegetate with. And then I also want to recognize that within site conditions, that's where those two sub-themes occurred. And that was the sub-theme of water and the sub-theme of site access and equipment. So of course, we're talking about wetlands here, and we're talking about trying to get wetland plants to grow. So water is a pretty important component of that. And we can see that displayed in this participant here in the middle that says, I'm very selective with where I would do a project where I know it's going to succeed with water. So one thing I want to mention is, or remind us of rather, is we just talked about how expensive these techniques are. And we just talked about how labor intensive they can be. So this requires a lot of investment in time and resources for these managers. So they're going to be really selective with where they choose to initiate a revegetation project, where they think they're going to have the highest likelihood of success. And then finally, we have a participant that is talking about wanting to initiate, or they just had initiated, a seeding effort as a part of their revegetation strategy. And they say, we purchased some equipment like a Marshmaster to help us with this effort. For anyone who has no idea what the heck a Marshmaster is, There is a drawing of one on the screen, but essentially what it is a really specialized piece of equipment that is capable of navigating within these wet settings. So wetlands are not the most easy landscape to navigate within. There's usually very few roads to access, but ultimately, again, we have to put revegetation on the landscape. So that requires consideration of how we're going to get there. How are we going to get our resources there? How are we going to get our labor there? How are we going to get those plant materials there? And for some managers, this means they have to invest in specialized equipment in order to access those sites. All right, so that kind of wraps up that first question. Now let's dive into my second question for this chapter. And again, as a reminder, this is what information or resources could assist wetland managers in revegetation decision-making. So as I mentioned earlier, I really wanted to make sure that I captured the most beneficial resource to these managers. And throughout that interview process, it became very obvious really early on that that resource was peer-to-peer learning opportunities. And once again, I think that the managers did a superb job of explaining why this is. So I might summarize this quote as well because it's a little long, but they say, I prefer peer-to-peer and communication and just getting together with people that have done revegetation, looking at what they actually did. You can see the results, you can decide that's what I need or no, that's not going to quite work out for us. So they're able to engage in this way where they can see some of those factors that might be at play, like site conditions, for instance, or see what labor requirements are there, and they can engage with the person that installed it. This dialogue helps them decide whether or not this is going to be a technique that they can feasibly implement. And then the next participant here says, I would definitely rely on other experienced managers in their process or decisions or recommendations for restoration. What I really liked about this quote is it kind of showed this degree of trust between this wetland manager community, where they really trust each other's skill set. They know that there's a wealth and a lot of knowledge there for their managers that they've gained along the way. And so ultimately, these manager recommendations can really sway others in their decision-making process. And then finally, we have a manager that says, I'm getting connected with other people that are trying different things. And it's fun to go see their projects, see what I can bring to my restoration work, or see what kind of better ideas I can suggest to theirs. And what's cool about this quote is there really is this sense of reciprocity between these managers, especially in these peer-to-peer learning settings, where they might go to this event with the intention of walking away with a lot of knowledge that was shared to them by their other managers, but they often have the opportunity to share their knowledge as well in this reciprocal way that can be really beneficial for them in this type of a resource and in this type of a setting. All right, so moving on to knowledge exchange here. How did we actually put these findings into practice? Well, as a direct result of that interview process, it became obvious what managers are wanting. And so because of that, we hosted a wetland restoration field tour in the fall of 2024. This was an in-person event that consisted of a morning session and an afternoon session, with the morning session incorporating a classroom setting where we had a series of presentations and an expert panel from every component of the wetland revegetation supply chain. So that meant we had researchers, we had wetland managers, we had wetland native plant vendors, and even seed collectors that were there that these participants got to engage with. We had a Q&A session, so they were able to ask those questions and kind of engage with these different experts. Then we took everyone out into the field where we visited some of our experimental restoration sites. We also had our researchers there, so these participants could engage directly with them, ask questions about how this was implemented, see those site conditions that are so important, engage whether or not this could be applied in their own settings. We also incorporated a wetland plant demonstration project, so that native wetland plant vendor actually brought out every single material type that is available to these managers through the market. They were implemented on the landscape, so they were able to gauge how much resources, tools, and equipment or labor force might be required to put these into practice. Again, bringing in all those factors that I mentioned earlier are so important in this decision-making process. We tried to do our best to incorporate it in this resource that we were providing to these managers. And then I'm happy to say that 71% of the participants of my study registered for this event, which is really nice for someone who's trying to create a resource for a targeted audience. Seeing that that percentage folks actually utilized this resource and this tool was really exciting. And then finally, I just want to mention briefly that I did record this entire event and produced videos that are available on the Whirl YouTube channel for anyone that wants to watch that. Okay, so that kind of wraps up that first chapter. Let's dive into my second chapter, where we will cover revegetation technique evaluation and technique trade-offs. Okay, so this is just a conceptual model of my thesis overall. And what I like about this is it really shows how all of these different factors that go well beyond ecological outcome alone are ultimately impacting this decision-making process and this technique selection process for these managers. And so I really wanted to figure out a way of incorporating some of those factors into how we start evaluating these different revegetation techniques. So I had one primary question within this chapter, and that was how do different wetland revegetation techniques compare when evaluated by factors managers perceive as the most influential to revegetation decision-making. So ultimately what this looked like is I compared these different techniques on cost, labor, native plant cover, and time required to meet establishment thresholds, all of which feed back into those 4 key factors that we talked about earlier. All right, so before I get started here, I just want to acknowledge that there are many different revegetation techniques available on the market for managers. For the purposes of my study, I'm only looking at 3 of those, and that's seed, plugs, and sod mats. For anyone who doesn't know what wetland sod is, this is a coconut core mat that has been planted with plugs and grown in a hydroponic setting before it is then installed at a restoration site. So it's really not too terribly far off from turf sod that you might see in a landscaping setting. So all of these techniques were installed at Farmington Bay Waterfowl Management Area. And that is located that's highlighted rather in orange on this map, and it is located on the southeastern shores of the Great Salt Lake. Now this experiment really took place in 2 parts, with an initial seed and plug planting effort at Site 1 that was actually part of a previous master's student graduate project. Shout out to Maddie, thank you for getting that going. And then I actually continued to monitor these sites as a part of my research. And that's located at Site 1 here in yellow. And then we also came back in and installed those sod mats at sites 2, 3, and 4, which are shown here in blue. Okay, and this is my experiment schedule and the timeline of these different events. So as I mentioned earlier, we had an initial planting of the seed and plugs. The seeding effort took place in July of 2022, and the plug planting took place in September of 2022. For all of the plots that received seed, they were all sown at a 3,876 pure live seed per meter squared rate. For all of the plots that received plugs, they received 49 plugs per plot. And then we came back in August of 2023 and installed all of those sod mats. We installed a total of 90 mats across those 3 different sites. So this is the species list for what we had incorporated into that seeding effort. For the seed, we had 2 mixes, a graminoid mix and a forb mix. And then for the plug planting, that was graminoid only, but it did include all of the same species that we had utilized in that seeding effort. Then for the sod mats, those were planted with a single species, but we did alternate between 2 species, and that was hardstone bulrush and Olnaise 3 square. For the data that I collected the percent total native plant cover, the time to reach establishment goals, labor requirements, cost requirements, and equipment needs. So these are the results for my study. I calculated the mean total native cover per revegetation technique for the 2024 monitoring season. And we can look at this plot. We see our observation date on the x-axis and the mean total native cover percentage on the y. Each of these techniques are color-coded, and the label for those is at the bottom of the screen. And I do want to draw your attention to the peak native cover percentages for each technique. So for sod mats, they actually peaked in August, and then they senesced throughout the September monitoring period. They did reach 46.6% total native cover. Plugs peaked in September again, and then they reached 45.7% total native cover. Seed reached 34, and the seed and plug mix reached 31.4%. Now, I also want to recognize that we did have an unplanted control. It did reach 16.5%. I also want to acknowledge that there has been some debate in the literature for the need to revegetate these wetlands. What I like about my findings is that we can see clearly here that regardless of which revegetation technique these managers are utilizing, they are all outperforming doing nothing at all. So if you take something away from the talk today, think about this. All right, so I also calculated the plant establishment time. For the purposes of my study, I defined establishment as the time and days required for plots to reach specific thresholds. I used a Kaplan-Meier risk survival analysis to calculate these numbers. And then I also want to recognize that these thresholds that you'll see here in this chart were directly informed by the managers in my interview process. So in other words, these are real life goals for these wetland managers for what they're wanting to achieve with their revegetation efforts. And that is 25%, 50%, and 80% total native cover. So I used the initial planting date as the experiment start, and then I censored these events by using the last monitoring date as the experiment end. And as we go through this, we can see clearly here that sod mats are by far the fastest establishing species, or sorry, technique, not species. And they reach 25% total native cover at 322 days. Plugs are still reaching that threshold, but it requires them 804 days. And you'll see here that the remaining techniques actually did not reach that threshold during the experiment timeline. So they require greater than 804 days. Similarly, we can see in these other categories that 50 and 80% total native cover actually require greater than the experiment timeline for those techniques to reach those thresholds. Really just meaning they need more time and we need a longer term monitoring project to assess this. All right, so I also calculated labor associated with these different techniques. But before we go through this chart, I just want to draw your attention to this new category that we have in this techniques column, and that is seeding at the large scale. So this was informed by personal communications with wetland managers. And the reason why it is incorporated is because seeding at the large scale is not really comparable to seeding at the experimental scale that we utilized in this study. And overall, I really want to provide a meaningful resource to these managers that they can actually make decisions on. And so because of that, I wanted to incorporate a more realistic type of seeding effort that's actually going to be used by these managers. So I just want to mention that where they differ is in the fact that seeding at this large scale incorporates that specialized equipment and a broadcast seeder, where at this experimental scale is all done by hand. And we can see how that changes up in all of these different categories that we'll be talking about. Okay, so I did break up these labor requirements into two different types, and that was planning and preparation and then site prep and implementation. The reason for this is because planning and preparation can be pretty variable by just what manager is actually doing it, whereas this site prep and implementation is going to be more consistent across the board for anyone that's implementing these techniques. And I really didn't want those numbers to skew one another. So if we look at planning and prep in this first column here, we will see an astronomical number of 645 hours in this seed experiment. And I just want to note that 607 of those hours were actually native seed collection that we do in our lab for our experiments. So if we subtract that number, we can actually see that a lot of these labor hours for the planning are pretty similar, and that's regardless of the scale, so that acre size for which they're being planned for. But then if we look in the other category of site prep and implementation, we can see a lot more variability there between those different techniques. So seeding at the large scale only requires 3 acre hours. Whereas if we look at seed at that experiment scale, we can see why I've included the large scale, because it jumps all the way up to over 16,000 acre hours to implement. Again, this is by hand. Plugs still come in at the most labor intensive, requiring over 28,000 acre hours to implement. And then sod mats are quite a bit less than that, but still a lot of labor, coming in at just over 1,000 acre hours. I also calculated the cost associated with each of these revegetation techniques. Again, we include that large scale seeding effort in this data set as well. I did break out these numbers into two categories also, and that was plant material cost separate from tools and equipment. The reason for this is because the tools and equipment that are used for these revegetation efforts are often a one-time or single investment, and those resources are utilized time and time again for many different revegetation projects. Whereas plant material costs are going to be a requirement for every single project. So I didn't want these numbers, again, to skew each other, and I also wanted to offer this transparency to our managers so they could get an idea of what this looked like. All right, so as we go through here, we can see seeding at the large scale is by far the least expensive in terms of plant material cost, coming in at just over $1,500 per acre. We can see that the trade-off, though, comes in at those tools and equipment, where it is by far the most expensive investment in those resources, where it requires over $205,000 of equipment costs. And that does include the purchase of a Marshmaster and a broadcast seeder. If anyone wants an itemized list of all these costs, that's available in the thesis materials. Okay, so if we look at the seed experiment, we can see that it's still pretty affordable in that plant material cost, a little more expensive, but it comes in at just over $2,000 dollars per acre. But then it drops super low in that tools and equipment, all the way down to a little over $500. Plugs are the most expensive in terms of the plant material cost, coming in at over $105,000 per acre, but they are the cheapest in the tools and equipment, so below $500. Sod mats are still pretty expensive, a little less than plugs, but they're coming in at over $98,000 per acre, and a little more expensive in that tools and equipment, but still pretty affordable at $844. So I've packaged all of this up into a handy dandy revegetation techniques trade-offs table so we can see these things side by side. Before you try to read all of this table, though, I want to first draw your attention to my favorability scale that we see at the top of the screen. So we can see that I've incorporated a color-coded favorability scale that ranges from least favorable in bright red to most favorable in bright green. And the reason why I want you to focus on this first is because I've also incorporated a scale for these labels within these cells that range from very low to very high. However, in some columns, very low might be the least favorable, whereas in other columns, it might be the most favorable. And we can see that in plant establishment in particular, where very low plant establishment is least favorable, whereas in our installation labor column, for instance, very low is the most favorable. So really the takeaway here for reading this is focusing on those colors rather than the cell values. Okay, so if we go through this here, we can see that seed is low in native cover, very low in plant establishment, and very high in equipment needs and cost, which are all more on that least favorable kind of scale. But the trade-off here is that they're also very low in installation labor and plant material cost, which is the most favorable. If we look at plugs, they're moderate in that native cover, and they're very low in equipment needs and cost, which is most favorable. But if we look at plant establishment, they are low, meaning they require longer to establish, but they're still meeting those establishment thresholds. But they come in at very high in both installation labor and plant material cost, which is least favorable. Then if we look at sod mats, they're coming in at moderate native cover, high plant establishment, very low installation labor, and very low equipment needs and cost, all which are more ranging towards that more favorable. But their trade-off is that they are very high plant material cost. So what does all of this mean for managers that are wanting to utilize this? Well, overall, the takeaway here is that none of these techniques excelled in all of these categories, but each of them did offer advantages under certain conditions. So this really shows that these contextual dependencies can really sway or should sway these technique selections. And these diverse options actually allow these managers to select a technique based on how well they are going to meet those goals and objectives while weighing the trade-offs in ecological outcome and considering those practical constraints. So I have a few hypothetical scenarios here that I want to walk through. So if we have a manager that has access to that specialized equipment, but they are limited in their labor force and they have a limited budget, they should probably turn towards seeding. If we have another manager that has a really high priority goal that requires a reliable native plant establishment or cover, and they have access to a large labor force like volunteers, but they are limited in that equipment and tools, then they might turn towards plugs. And then finally, if we have a manager that has a pretty good sized budget, but they are really limited in their timeline, meaning they need a really rapidly establishing technique, then they should turn towards sod mats. All right, so that kind of concludes my 2 chapters, and I've got a slide for some takeaway messages here. So ultimately, if our goal is to increase the use of revegetation, we really must prioritize the reporting of both ecological results as well as those practical requirements, because the combination of both of those things are really guiding these revegetation decisions. We also need to disseminate our findings in preferred ways for our intended audience. And then I also wanted to leave you all with this quote that really stuck with me during my interviews. And this was a manager that was giving me advice. And they say it's really easy to create a one-size-fits-all that doesn't do any good for anyone. And so the big takeaway here is sometimes we get into this habit of trying to distill down or narrow down our recommendations to folks. But really what they could benefit more from is a diverse array of options as long as they incorporate those practical requirements and report them in a transparent way. So incorporating this transparency actually enables these managers to adapt their strategies to overcome the challenges and the constraints that they might have. And with that, I just want to acknowledge that the EPA did fund this project, and I want to thank my committee members, Courtney Flint and Ed Hamill. Special thanks to Karin Kettering. Karin, I couldn't have done this project without you, and I couldn't have had a better advisor. I also want to thank the Wetland Ecology and Restoration Lab. I would read through this list, but I know we're already tight on time. But thank all you guys. You've been so supportive along the way. And I also want to shout out to Utah Forestry, Fire and State Lands and the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources for collaborating with me on this effort and supporting this research. And then finally, I have to pay special thanks to all of my interview participants. It was such a pleasure getting to meet and know every single one of you. I'm so appreciative of your interest in participating with me in this project and sharing your knowledge about wetlands. It's so cool to learn from all of you and for you to trust me in sharing this with others. I'm very grateful for that opportunity. And then also, I just want to pay special thanks to my friends, family, and colleagues from all across the country that have supported me in this process. And with that, I will take any questions.
Yes, that was really great. It was cool to see it all like synthesized and summarized in a concise way. So nice job. I guess I'm wondering, from all of your interviews, was there anything that stood out to you as being surprising, or did 1 or 2 people say something that was kind of different than the rest of the group?
Yeah, so I think if I'm being truly honest, I was a little bit surprised that the preferred resource was these peer-to-peer learning opportunities. So I kind of expected, going towards more of these extension documents that we see a lot of times in more of an academic setting, right? So I had full intention of actually going down that route with my original research proposal. And so it wasn't that I didn't know or anticipate that these social learning opportunities could be important. I just didn't realize how important they really were for everyone. So that was honestly the key takeaway for me during that process. And then, just that quote that I kind of left with also really stuck with me, because again, we get into this habit of trying to like point someone in like a particular direction when really they just want more information, so that they can change and adapt however they need. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's really cool you put together the field tour, and actually, like, once you found this finding, actually put something together. I'm curious whether you noticed, like, it seems like the field tour was like pretty organized in terms of how people were spreading information. But did you notice people like making connections, like just walking around and just talking with each other? Like, do you feel like that facilitated those kinds of conversations?
Great question. And yes, this networking opportunity that exists in these peer-to-peer learning settings or social learning settings is really prevalent. You know, like they get the opportunity to engage with people that they maybe have never met before. And so, yes, that opportunity definitely exists. And just because we did bring in, you know, all these different folks from the different components of the supply chain, a lot of folks hadn't actually interacted that much with like a native seed collector, for instance, or for that, you know, native plant vendor. So that networking opportunity that they were able to experience and engage with, they definitely led to them connecting with them into the future. The reason why I know that is because this actually took place kind of mid-interview process. And so when I conducted some of my final interviews, I actually got amazing feedback from the managers about how much they were able to interact with these different folks as a result of that field tour. So, you know, not to, you know, speak directly for them, but they did acknowledge like how important that opportunity was for them and how they got to meet all these other folks that are now in their network. And so, yeah, it can be really important and an important component of it for sure. Yeah. Thank you.
I was curious if like the vendor relationships specifically came up in the interviews before the tour, like, and what you could say about like the importance of vendors or seed availability for the managers.
Yep. So the vendor component did come up a lot, and it came up in some of these logistical components that were one of those major factors, but I just didn't have time to talk about today. So that's a really important factor for managers that have to operate within this really tight annual time, right? So like a lot of managers that I have in my study have to spend all of their funding within a fiscal year. However, the native plant vendors operate on a much longer time scale, including like doing these custom grow orders, for instance, right? And so they definitely mentioned how that is really hard to navigate in terms of like a practical or feasible setting, trying to operate within their budgetary timelines and trying to match that up with plant vendor timelines. I think that was the biggest takeaway for like where the struggle was for those vendors in particular. I mean, of course, they would like to see more species diversity and stuff like that, like in the from vendors. But if I could pinpoint something that was really problematic, it was this matching up of these different timelines, and just struggles there. I'm not sure how to alleviate that though. Like I'm not sure like how to make that process better. It's kind of a tough one.
There are no more questions. Let's thank Loren again for the presentation.